It's time for the Daily Stand Up Podcast presented by Agile Dad with your host, Lee Henson. Without any further ado, let's get started.
It's Friday, and it's time for our Agile Not So Agile episode of the Daily Stand Up Podcast. And with today being September 9th, I thought it'd be a good idea to take a few moments and talk about not forgetting the events that happened just over 20 years ago, the September 11th attacks on the Twin Towers and other locations. And I always try to find some way to do a tribute, but this year I was looking for something that would be not too over the top, but something that would give a, I don't want to say a light, but an informative view that was easily understood. And I found an article that I absolutely adore, of all places, on National Geographic Kids. I'll drop a link down below. It's just a great way to teach your kids to remember what happened on September 11th. And here's the story. It says on September 11, 2001, people in New York City woke up to a beautiful late summer day. It was a Tuesday. People were preparing for another day of work and school. Thousands of people headed for the World Trade Center, a complex of 7 buildings that included a pair of skyscrapers that were known as the Twin Towers. Each tower had 110 stories and stood about 1,360 feet high. The tallest buildings in New York City at the time, the Twin Towers rose above the city's downtown skyline. Nobody there knew that in just a few hours, both buildings would fall. People who live in New York are used to seeing and hearing airplanes flying overhead, but on the morning of September 11th, people stopped on the streets and looked up. The sound of an approaching plane was just too loud, and the plane seemed to be flying too low. To the horror of the people watching below, the airplane flew straight into one of the twin towers of the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 11 hit the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. The impact of the crash tore a hole that stretched from the 93rd floor to the 99th floor of the building. Smoke and flames poured out of the tower. Many people thought that they had just seen a terrible accident, but 17 minutes later, a second plane flew into another one of the World Trade Center buildings, this time the South Tower. United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the 77th through 85th floors of the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. Some cell phone and TV station cameras caught the second attack on film. The footage was played over and over again on television. Soon people knew that hijackers, individuals who capture an aircraft, ship, or vehicle by force, had taken over the planes. A group of men had taken control of the cockpit of each airplane and flown them into the buildings on purpose. The United States was under attack. About a half hour after the second tower was struck in New York City, hijackers crashed a third airplane, American Airlines Flight 77, hit the west side of the Pentagon, a 5-sided concrete building that serves as the headquarters for the U.S. Department of Defense in Arlington, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. The plane's fuel tanks exploded, and 2 giant fireballs blasted into the air. The U.S. government ordered all planes flying over the country to land as soon as possible, but it was too late for United Airlines Flight 93. Hijackers had already taken control of this fourth aircraft. They were flying the plane towards Washington, D.C. Passengers and crew members on the plane called loved ones who told them about the other attacks in New York and Virginia. People on Flight 93 thought their aircraft would definitely be used as a weapon, too. So they fought the hijackers to get control of the plane. In a phone call recorded as passengers and crew began to fight back, passenger Todd Beamer was heard saying, "Are you ready? Okay, let's roll." Flight 93 eventually crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The crash site was close to the hijackers' likely target, a government building in Washington, D.C. Back in New York City, dark smoke poured out from the Twin Towers. People rushed to escape the area, which later became known as Ground Zero. First responders, including police officers, firefighters, and paramedics, arrived within minutes of the first attack on the World Trade Center. They rushed into both towers to help people trapped inside, even though it would be extremely difficult to rescue operation. Almost all the elevators at the Twin Towers had stopped working, so rescuers started climbing upstairs, but many were blocked by rubble or fire. Still, firefighters forged ahead, ignoring the danger. When the airplanes hit the Twin Towers, they caused massive damage to concrete floors, which were destroyed. Steel support beams were cut in two. Floors above the crash site started to sag downward. Meanwhile, the sprinklers in both buildings were damaged. There was nothing to stop the raging fires, which became hot enough to weaken steel. The buildings were growing unstable. Then they collapsed. The South Tower fell first. Once it began to crumble, it took only 10 seconds for it to fully collapse. The impact caused the North Tower to shake, and it too crumbled and fell to the ground 29 minutes later. First responders helped many people before the Twin Towers collapsed. More than 25,000 people made it out of the buildings before they fell, but nearly 3,000 people from the towers, the Pentagon, and the four airplanes died in attacks on that day. The events of September 11, 2001 shook the nation. The United States government had to respond. President George W. Bush led the country in a day of prayer and remembrance. Then he led the nation's effort to find and punish the people who had caused the attacks. A terrorist group based in Afghanistan, a country in the Middle East, called Al Qaeda, claimed responsibility for the 9/11 attacks. Their leader was Osama bin Laden. Al Qaeda and bin Laden considered the United States to be their enemy, which was why the hijackers used the planes to attack important U.S. buildings. In total, 19 hijackers took over the four planes that crashed on 9/11. World leaders promised to help the United States punish Al Qaeda and locate their leader. In October of 2001, the United States and its allies started military actions in Afghanistan, searching for members of Al Qaeda who worked with bin Laden to plan to carry out the attacks on 9/11. It would take nearly 10 years for these forces to locate and kill bin Laden himself, who was eventually discovered hiding in nearby Pakistan in May of 2011. Although the 9/11 attacks took place in the United States, many people from other countries felt that a terrorist attack on such a powerful nation was a threat to peace around the world. They brought flowers to U.S. embassies and lit candles to honor the victims. They gathered to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. One French newspaper showed its support with a front-page headline, Nous sommes tous Américains, meaning we're all Americans. After the attacks, many people in the United States wanted to show their support for their country too. They gave flowers, candles, food, and thank you notes to the first responders. U.S. residents and organizations donated a record-breaking $2.8 billion to help the families of victims of the attacks. By the end of 2001, more than 300 U.S. charities were raising money for this cause. Most Americans tried to help others after the 9/11 attacks, but some people took their anger and fear out on people who looked like they came from the same Middle Eastern countries as the hijackers. Innocent people who had nothing to do with the events of 9/11 were attacked and not treated fairly. 20 years later, a lot has changed since September 11, 2001. To prevent similar terrorist attacks from happening in the country, the United States government created the Department of Homeland Security. The organization is responsible for border security, immigrations and customs, and disaster relief and prevention. But they also keep a close watch over suspected terrorist groups and send warnings if they think the country and its people are in danger. That way, the government can protect them. Air travel became stricter after 9/11. Before the attacks, private security companies performed all airport screenings. After September 11th, the TSA, Transportation Security Administration, was created to give the federal government direct responsibility for all airport screenings. In 2002, the TSA began using explosive detection systems nationwide to screen all bags for explosives. They also installed more advanced technologies, such as full body scanners, to ensure travelers weren't trying to bring anything harmful on a plane. The hijackers used weapons they carried on board to gain control of the aircrafts. Other rules, like using small containers for liquids like shampoo or removing shoes during security checks, were put in place to make sure people didn't sneak dangerous things on board. The United States also entered a long war on terror abroad. In addition to sending troops to Afghanistan, Bush also sent troops to Iraq in 2003 because of rumors that the country was hiding dangerous weapons. By the time Barack Obama was elected president in 2008, some 4,500 American soldiers had died in Afghanistan and Iraq, with many thousands more wounded. Many Americans felt the loss of life wasn't worth it. Bin Laden was still missing and no weapons were ever found. But in 2011, bin Laden was finally located and killed. His death was a blow to Al Qaeda and gave some U.S. citizens hope that progress was finally being made in the fight against terrorism. By the end of 2011, Obama had withdrawn all combat troops from Iraq, but U.S. troops were still fighting in Afghanistan. By the end of his second term in 2017, another terrorist group, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, threatened the region throughout Obama's presidency and into Donald Trump's single term as president as well. Donald Trump's term in office, he announced the removal of all troops from Afghanistan by May of 2021. Trump's successor, Joe Biden, delayed the removal, announcing that the United States would be removing all troops from Afghanistan by August 31st instead, just before the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. Memorials now stand to pay tribute to all those who lost their lives on September 11, 2001. The 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York City contains pools set within each area where the Twin Towers stood. The names of all the 9/11 victims from each tower are inscribed on bronze panels. And the National 9/11 Pentagon Memorial, each of the 184 benches is dedicated to a victim of the Virginia attack. And the Tower of Voices at Flight 93 National Memorial in Pennsylvania has 40 wind chimes that honor the plane's passengers and crew members. The attacks on September 11th shook the world and made people realize that even a powerful country like the United States could be part or a victim of terror. But the horrific event also brought Americans closer together. As U.S. Senator John Kerry said at the time, it was the worst day we have ever seen, but it brought out the best in all of us. Many famous people were scheduled to be on some of those flights and avoided being on those flights. Two to come to mind were Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, who was supposed to be on the American Airlines flight that crashed into the towers, and he was doing a show the night before and got to bed very late and literally woke up late, missed his flight, ran through the airport, got there in the nick of time, begged to let him on a plane, and they wouldn't reopen the door to let him on. So kind of interesting. Another was Mark Wahlberg, who was supposed to be on those flights. He canceled his flight the day before. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, while the world lost many, many, many great people, and we acknowledge that terror and bad things happen, I think in remembrance of 9/11, the very best thing we could do is to look for the good in people. Seek out the best in individuals. Try to find ways that we can connect and show love as opposed to always showing hate. And if we can rededicate our focus to not forgetting the tragedies and the terrible things that happen, but to remember how we behaved after those events, I think that that's going to help us be a better people, and it's going to help us eventually overcome all those obstacles that are holding us back. So I hope you have an amazing weekend. I hope that you do something special to commemorate 9/11 and to think about those individuals. But most importantly, I hope you extend a hand of love and fellowship to someone else and reach out to them in their time of need. Because I think that if we would have had the world as a better, more loving place, that none of these things had to happen. As always, I encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile. Until next week, do take care.